My name is Elias, and before the events I am about to recount, my life was, to put it plainly, ordinary. I was a man accustomed to the quiet hum of the everyday, the steady rhythm of a life that, while perhaps lacking in dramatic flair, was comfortable in its predictability. I had a job that paid the bills, a house that provided shelter, a wife, Sarah, who was the anchor of my existence, a constant source of love and support, even when my own shortcomings tested her patience. And then there was my daughter, Clara, whose bright, inquisitive mind and boundless energy brought a spark of joy into my otherwise routine days. Her school plays, particularly, were sacred events, a highlight in the otherwise monotonous schedule of my weeks. They were an opportunity for me to escape the mundane, if only for a little while, and to experience the magic of childhood again through her eyes. I was, as I said, not a religious man in the conventional sense. I had never been one for strict dogma or fervent devotion. I considered myself to be more of a practical person, someone who relied on reason and logic, more comfortable with the tangible realities of the world rather than the abstract concepts of faith and spirituality. I believed in being a good person, in treating others with kindness and respect, but I had never given much thought to the existence of a higher power, or to the possibility of a spiritual realm that lay beyond our physical world. I was content with the world I knew, a world that was governed by the laws of physics and the patterns of cause and effect, a world that was, for the most part, predictable. However, that perspective was shattered on a Tuesday. It was a Tuesday like any other initially, except that it was raining. And the kind of rain that seemed to seep into everything, a relentless downpour that made the world seem muted and gray. It was the day my life took a dramatic turn, a sharp veer off the predictable path, the day I experienced something that defied explanation, something that transcended the boundaries of logic and reason, and forced me to confront a reality far more complex than I could ever have imagined. It was the day of the car accident, the day of the blinding light and the profound silence that followed, the day I was shown a truth so profound, so terrifying, that it has left an indelible mark on my soul, forever changing the way I perceive the world. Now, I am compelled to share this story, to bear witness to the events that unfolded, not because I seek recognition or validation, but because I believe with every fiber of my being that it's a warning, a message of vital importance that needs to be heard, that cannot be ignored or dismissed out of hand. It was, as I said, a typical Tuesday, or at least it began that way. The sky was overcast, and the rain had been coming down for what felt like hours, a relentless deluge that seemed determined to wash away the entire city. I was running late, a chronic affliction, a recurring symptom of my perpetually overbooked schedule, my mind a whirlwind of work deadlines and looming bills, a constant cycle of stress and self-reproach that seemed to have become a permanent feature of my life. I was rushing to get to Clara's school play, the same play I had promised her I wouldn't miss, a promise that, if I were honest with myself, I had made too many times to count and had broken with equal frequency. The memory of her disappointment the last time I was late, the way her small face had crumpled in sadness, still stung, a painful reminder of how often I had let her down, of how often I had failed to be the father she deserved. The rain hammered down on the windshield of my old truck, each drop a small drumbeat against my growing anxiety, and the wipers struggled to keep up, smearing the already blurry world into an indistinct mess of grays and blacks, making my journey all the more difficult. My phone buzzed almost constantly, a cacophony of worried and slightly frustrated texts from Sarah, each one adding another layer to my already mounting stress, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was letting them down, that I was constantly disappointing the people I loved most. I typed out a hurried response, "On my way, sorry." But even as I sent it, it felt inadequate, a hollow apology that did little to alleviate the weight of my failings. The traffic was a slow-moving nightmare, a sea of red taillights stretching out endlessly before me, and the honking horn seemed to echo the chaos that was brewing within, amplifying my sense of being completely overwhelmed. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to regain control of my mounting anxiety, the growing dread that was threatening to consume me. And I silently prayed that the play hadn't started, and that maybe, just maybe, I could make it there in time, and that Clara wouldn't be too disappointed to see her father rushing in late again, disrupting her performance. The streetlights flickered erratically, casting strange, elongated shadows that danced ominously on the rain-slicked road, and for a brief, unsettling moment, the world seemed surreal, as though I had been transported into a badly made film, completely unaware of the catastrophic event that was lurking just around the corner, the tragic twist that was about to change my life forever. And the rain kept coming. The tires screeched, a sound that tore through the silence like a banshee's cry, an ear-splitting noise that sent a jolt of fear straight to my heart, and I knew, instinctively, that something horrific was about to happen. It was a sound that felt both real and unreal at the same time, as if the very fabric of reality was tearing apart, and it was accompanied by the sudden appearance of a blinding light, a radiant and overwhelming glow that slammed into me with the force of a runaway train. It wasn't just a bright light. It was something more, something intense and all-encompassing, an energy that seemed to penetrate every cell of my being, as though the very structure of the universe was imploding around me. I felt a bone-jarring jolt, a sharp and searing pain in my chest that was followed by an excruciating wave of heat that felt as if I was being burned from the inside out, and the metal of my old truck buckled and twisted around me like it was made of paper. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the chaotic symphony of light and sound abruptly ceased, replaced by an unnerving, deafening silence, and the world seemed to go still as if it had been placed on pause. There was no pain, not immediately at least, just a strange and unsettling sense of detachment, a feeling of being completely removed from the wreckage, as though my consciousness had been ejected from my body. I remember the sensation of weightlessness, of floating upwards, and then the unnerving realization that I was no longer inside the car, but hovering just above it, watching the mangled metal and shattered glass from a detached perspective. I could see my truck below, a crumpled and broken mess, a mangled monument to the suddenness and brutality of the accident, and I felt a mix of shock, regret, and a profound sense of terror, the terrifying awareness of how close I had come to the end, how easily life could be extinguished in a moment just like that. The screech of the tires and the shattering of glass were etched into my mind with crystal clarity, a morbid and unforgettable image that was replaying itself endlessly, each moment flashing back in terrifying detail. It wasn't just the absence of sound that was so unsettling, but the absence of all physical sensations, as though my body had become nothing more than an empty shell, a discarded husk of flesh and bone. I had been so preoccupied with my own worries and frustrations, so lost in the mundane chaos of my daily life that I hadn't even seen the oncoming car, hadn't registered the danger until it was too late, and now I was left with nothing but the cold and stark realization of how completely unprepared I had been. The silence was absolute, a void that seemed to stretch out infinitely in all directions, and I had the strange sensation that I was no longer bound by the laws of the physical world, that I had somehow transcended the limitations of time and space. I felt as though I was suspended in nothingness, an infinite expanse of pure potential, and the rain, which had been so overwhelming just moments before, was now distant, like a faint memory from another life. It was a bizarre and surreal sensation, like watching a film from outside the screen, observing my own possible demise with a detached curiosity, and I was no longer Elias, the frustrated husband and father, the man who had been so consumed by his own failings and disappointments, but something else, something more ethereal, something completely undefined, as though I were witnessing my own existence dissolve into the very fabric of the universe, and I was nothing more than a consciousness, pure and simple. The chaos of the crash had dissipated, replaced by an unexpected and profound stillness, and a bizarre serenity that was both comforting and utterly terrifying at the same time, and I was floating up into a different plane. I was no longer bound by the confines of the wreckage, the mangled metal and shattered glass, a distant memory that was rapidly fading, and I felt myself floating upwards, gently being pulled by a force that was both irresistible and inexplicably comforting. There was no pain, no fear, just a deep sense of peace, a tranquility that permeated every fiber of my being, soothing every ache and worry that I had been carrying. I was being drawn towards a light, a beacon that pulsated with a warm, inviting glow, like a heartbeat in the void, and the light was not harsh or blinding, but soft and warm, and filled with an undeniable sense of love, like being enveloped in the most tender and perfect embrace imaginable. It wasn't like the light of the sun, but something far more profound, a source of illumination that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once, as though it were woven into the very fabric of existence. It was an almost overwhelming sense of love, a feeling of being completely accepted and completely safe, and the peace that washed over me was like a balm to my weary and troubled soul. It was an almost unbearable relief from the constant anxieties and burdens that I had been carrying for so long, a sense of release that I had not even known I had been craving. The world below, the broken remains of my truck, became increasingly smaller, as if it was just a discarded toy, a forgotten relic from a life that was no longer mine, and I felt a sense of separation, of being released from the earthly ties that had bound me for so long. I was being drawn into something larger, something beyond the limited capacity of my comprehension, and the pull was both gentle and irresistible, guiding me deeper and further into this unknown realm. The sense of being separate from my body was strange, to say the least, but also incredibly liberating, and I could still see my body below, a distant shell lying in the wreckage, but it no longer felt like it was me. It was as if I had shed my physical form, like a butterfly emerging from its cocoon, and I felt a freedom that I had never experienced before, a release from the physical limitations and the relentless pain that had been such a constant feature of my life. The peace that enveloped me was profound, a stark contrast to the chaos of the car crash and to the mundane worries that had dominated my everyday existence. I felt as though I was being welcomed home, as if I had finally found the place where I was always meant to be, that I was being guided towards a place of complete love and acceptance. As I ascended, the light intensified, wrapping around me like a warm and luminous blanket, and it began to take on a form, a shape that was both familiar and foreign, an image that was being etched into the very fabric of my memory, and I knew that something truly significant was about to happen. The intensity of the light didn't hurt my eyes. Instead, it felt like an infusion of energy, filling me with a warmth that reached the deepest corners of my being, a source of power that seemed to revitalize me from the inside out. I felt safe and protected, completely secure in this loving embrace, and the fear that I had experienced during the crash was completely gone, replaced by a profound sense of trust and surrender. I knew with absolute certainty that everything was going to be all right, that I was in a place of pure love and acceptance, and that my journey had just begun. It was a stark and beautiful contrast to the gray and rain-soaked world I had left behind. Then I saw him. It was Jesus, but not the image I had encountered in stained glass windows or the illustrations in my daughter's children's Bible. Not the stern, imposing figure that had been portrayed in so many paintings and sculptures throughout history. He was not a human man in any conventional sense, but rather a radiant being of pure light and love, and he had a form that was both familiar and completely foreign at the same time, a paradoxical image that defied all earthly description. His form seemed to shimmer and shift, like a flame dancing in the wind, and he was surrounded by a soft, warm glow that seemed to emanate from within, illuminating everything around him, and yet somehow not blinding me. His eyes were deep pools of infinite love and understanding, like looking into the very heart of compassion itself, and I felt as if he could see every part of me, every thought, every feeling, every hidden desire, and yet he still loved me, completely and unconditionally. His presence filled the space around me with an indescribable sense of grace and serenity and peace, and he radiated a pure and unadulterated kindness, a warmth that reached deep into the very core of my being. He was not a figure of judgment or condemnation, but rather a being of profound compassion and acceptance, and the weight of all my transgressions and failings simply seemed to melt away in his presence. "Elias, you've been brought here for a reason," he said, and the words, while spoken in a gentle voice, resonated with such power. It seemed to vibrate through every fiber of my being, every cell of my existence, and they shook me to my core, leaving me both awestruck and deeply humbled. It wasn't a voice that I heard with my physical ears, but more of a resonance, a vibration that transcended my ordinary senses and traveled directly to my heart, and the sound was both soft and powerful, like the echo of a cosmic harp. I felt like a small child standing before a wise and loving father, filled with a sense of awe and reverence, and I was overwhelmed by the feeling of profound and complete acceptance, as the love that emanated from him was so intense that it washed away all my doubts, all my fears, all the insecurities that I had carried for so long. I was at peace, yet also overwhelmed by his presence, a paradox that seemed to embody the very nature of his being, and I couldn't take my eyes off of him, drawn to the depths of mercy and forgiveness that were reflected in his gaze, and I knew that he saw me not as the sum of my mistakes, but as something far more, something far better than I believed myself to be. He was not the stern judge that I had sometimes imagined, but rather a beacon of hope, a shepherd who was always ready to embrace his lost sheep, and the feeling of acceptance that flowed from him was more profound than anything I had ever experienced, a love so complete and so all-encompassing that it seemed to transcend the very boundaries of understanding. I had never believed myself worthy of such a love, and standing before him, I felt completely accepted, every flaw, every imperfection, every hidden weakness welcomed into his light, and it was a moment of profound clarity and awakening, a moment that shattered all my preconceptions and shattered all my doubts, and I realized that the journey I had been on, with all its challenges and hardships, with all its missed opportunities and broken promises, had led me to this very moment, this encounter of divine grace, and that this one moment was the one that would change the course of my life forever. A strange calm settled over me, a peace that quieted the incessant anxieties and self-doubts that had haunted me for so long, and the feeling of love that emanated from him was unlike anything I had ever encountered before, a pure and unconditional love that was both overwhelming and profoundly comforting at the same time. It was a homecoming like no other, a return to a place I had never even known existed, and yet it felt as though I had always belonged. He showed me a vision of the earth, a panoramic view of the planet that unfolded before my very eyes, like a living tapestry of time and space, and at first it looked beautiful, a vibrant and thriving sphere, teeming with life and innovation, a testament to the boundless potential of humanity. I saw cities that shimmered and gleamed with light, incredible monuments of human ingenuity that seemed to reach towards the sky, and technology that promised to usher in a new era of progress and enlightenment, a world that appeared to be on the cusp of some great transformation. But as I watched closer, as the vision zoomed in, the closer I looked at the details, I saw shadows creeping in, like a subtle disease slowly infecting a healthy body, a kind of spiritual rot that was beginning to undermine the very foundations of human civilization. I saw people addicted to technology, their eyes glazed over, their faces illuminated by the cold, artificial glow of their screens, and their minds and hearts slowly being consumed by the endless stream of information and entertainment, and it was as if their souls were withering. They were losing connection with one another, with the natural world around them, and perhaps worst of all, with their own inner selves, being drawn further and further into a digital illusion, a virtual reality that was gradually replacing the real thing. It was a subtle and insidious takeover, and most were completely unaware, their minds so easily manipulated by the very devices they believed were making their lives easier and more convenient, their freedom slowly being eroded by the very tools they had embraced, tools they believed were enhancing their potential. I watched as families grew apart, children with empty, hollow eyes, their faces lit only by the artificial glow of their screens, and the constant buzz of digital connection had replaced real human interaction, the heartfelt exchanges that once defined the family unit. They were surrounded by others, and yet they were utterly alone, each one trapped in their own little bubble of digital engagement, and the capacity for empathy, for genuine connection, for meaningful shared experience, was slowly beginning to fade away. This wasn't progress. It was a form of regression, a slow and insidious decay of the very qualities that make us human, a slow unraveling of the social fabric that had once held us together. The vibrant colors of the world seemed to fade and grow muted, replaced by a dull, lifeless gray, and the sounds of genuine laughter and joy were drowned out by the incessant hum of technology, a constant droning noise that seemed to permeate every aspect of life, and I could sense a feeling of unease that was slowly and steadily creeping into the collective consciousness. It was as if the world itself was slowly being drained of its life force, its vital energy being siphoned off into the cold and unfeeling circuits of machines, and I could see the subtle ways in which this shift was causing irreparable damage, and this slow and steady drain was tearing at the very seams of society, and the whole world seemed to be on a slow spiral downwards. I watched as people became increasingly isolated, trapped in their digital bubbles, their emotions stunted, their empathy diminished, and surrounded by others, and yet utterly alone, living in a fabricated virtual reality that had become more real and more compelling than the real world. And the beauty and wonder of the physical world was being exchanged for the sterile and often toxic confines of the digital realm. It was a chilling and terrifying spectacle, a stark and undeniable warning of the path we were on, a road that seemed to lead to nothing but emptiness and despair, a self-made prison of our own invention, and a slow march towards a dark abyss. I felt a deep and profound sorrow wash over me, an overwhelming sense of loss for the beauty and connection that was being squandered, a deep and genuine grief for the humanity that was being slowly eroded before my very eyes, and it was a sight that I will never forget, a memory that will haunt me for the rest of my days. How could I, just an ordinary man, a flawed and fallible human being, possibly carry a message so important, so profound and all-encompassing, a message that seemed to demand a level of wisdom and authority that I simply did not possess? I wondered, the fear starting to creep back into my heart, a chilling reminder of my limitations and the weight of the vision threatening to overwhelm me, to crush me beneath its immensity. My life had been a patchwork of mistakes, a complicated and messy narrative of missed opportunities and broken promises, and I could barely manage to keep my own life in order. I could barely hold my own family together. So how could I possibly bear the weight of such a grave and momentous warning for the entire world, for all of humanity? I was not a prophet, nor was I a saint, and I was, in all honesty, not even a particularly good man by any conventional standards. I was just a flawed and imperfect man, someone who had struggled with his own inner demons, with fits of anger and impatience, with a constant barrage of self-doubt, and a deep-seated sense of inadequacy that had followed me for all of my life. And the idea that I, of all people, would be chosen to deliver this message seemed preposterous, absurd, almost impossible to believe. I looked at myself, this simple man who struggled to make ends meet, who often lost his temper at the slightest provocation, who had let his family down more times than I would care to admit, and I couldn't fathom how I, of all the billions of people on the earth, could possibly be the one chosen to share this profound warning, this dire message of impending doom. The thought of going back to the physical world, of trying to explain what I had seen, to share the vision that I had been shown, filled me with a sense of overwhelming dread and anxiety. I could just imagine the skeptical looks, the disbelieving stares, the raised eyebrows, the dismissive remarks, and I knew, deep in my heart, that most people would simply brush me off as crazy. As someone who had lost his mind during the car accident, or as someone who had simply made the whole thing up, and I wasn't sure if I had the emotional fortitude, the inner strength, to face such disbelief and ridicule. I had always been a man who preferred to stay in the background, to avoid the spotlight, to live in the quiet shadows, and the thought of speaking out, of sharing this intensely personal and challenging message with the world, and the very idea of making myself vulnerable to the judgment of others, filled me with a profound sense of terror. It felt like an impossible task, a burden that was far too heavy for me to carry alone, and the fear was almost crippling, and I couldn't help but question whether I had misinterpreted the whole thing, if maybe I had just imagined what I had seen, and that perhaps this message was intended for someone else, for someone more worthy than me. I had spent too much time focused on my own shortcomings, so consumed by my own personal problems, that it seemed completely absurd that I would be the one chosen to offer guidance to others, to share a warning that the entire world desperately needed to hear. And the absurdity of the whole thing was almost too much to bear. It felt like a cruel joke, a cosmic error, that I, of all the people on the planet, would be burdened with such a monumental responsibility. And despite all my doubts, despite all my fears, I knew deep in my heart that I couldn't ignore what I had seen, no matter how terrifying or overwhelming it might be. I knew, deep in my soul, that this wasn't about me, not about my weaknesses nor my failures, but about the people I loved, about all of the people on earth who were heading down the same destructive path, and the need to warn them, to guide them, to try and help them find their way back, was far too great to ignore. Then he spoke again, his voice resonating with an immeasurable sadness, a sorrow that was so profound that it echoed in the very depths of my soul, a grief so palpable that it seemed to permeate every fiber of my being and to ripple throughout the entire fabric of existence. It was a voice filled with both love and pain, and it was a voice that I will never forget for as long as I live. Your prayer, uttered in a moment of desperation, Elias, ignited a battle that you could not possibly have imagined. You asked for help, not just for yourself, but for your family, and that fervent, heartfelt prayer, born of genuine need, destroyed 10,000 demons that held your loved ones hostage, that held them captive in the shadows of darkness. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow, the revelation so unexpected and shocking that I struggled to understand, to fully grasp the magnitude of what he was telling me, and I was left reeling from the impact of the truth. I had never thought of prayer as a weapon, as a form of spiritual warfare, nor had I ever imagined that it could have such immense power, such a profound impact on the unseen world, and the realization that my own desperate plea, my own heartfelt cry for help, had ignited a cosmic battle, was both terrifying and awe-inspiring at the same time. I remembered that moment, the moment of utter desperation, that desperate prayer that I had uttered in the silence of my truck. Right before the accident, a cry to God for help, a plea to protect my family, to forgive me for my many shortcomings, for all the times I had failed them and had let them down. It had been a cry that came from the very depths of my despair, a prayer born of helplessness and overwhelming fear, and I had never imagined, not even in my wildest dreams, that it could have such far-reaching and earth-shattering consequences. He revealed that these demons were not the horned monsters that I had imagined from the stories of my childhood, but rather, they were insidious forces that fed off of the disconnection, the isolation, and the technological obsession that had begun to pervade human society. And they were using the digital world as their hunting ground, as a breeding ground for their malicious schemes, and that they preyed on people's vulnerabilities, pulling them further into darkness, into isolation, and into despair. They were using the anonymity of the internet, the endless stream of distractions and entertainment, to amplify people's insecurities and fears, to sow seeds of discord and resentment within families and communities, and they found the cracks in relationships, the hidden wounds and unaddressed resentments, and they were using these to push people further and further apart. The fate of my family, and indeed the fate of everyone on earth, was hanging in the balance, their souls vulnerable to these unseen, dark forces, and I realized with startling clarity that the battle was not some distant conflict, but it was happening here, and now, in our hearts and in our homes, in the quiet corners of our lives. And I was no longer a bystander, but was a participant in a war that I never knew existed, but one that I was now bound to fight. I understood that the enemy wasn't always loud or obvious, that it often worked in subtle and insidious ways, creeping into our lives disguised as progress, disguised as convenience, and that the battle was for the very soul of humanity, and that my prayer had unleashed something that could not be ignored or left alone. The stakes were immeasurably higher than I could have ever possibly imagined, and my own personal struggles, my own doubts and anxieties, seemed so insignificant in the face of this epic cosmic war, and I knew that I had to do everything in my power to do my part and to carry this message to as many people as I possibly could. It was a call to action, not for some physical war that was fought with swords and guns, but for a spiritual conflict, a battle for the hearts and minds of humanity, and I knew that I had to be a part of it. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, the experience was over and I was back. The ethereal light that had surrounded me faded away like smoke, and the hospital room snapped back into sharp focus, the sterile white walls, the cold, metallic surfaces, and the incessant beeping of the monitors, a jarring intrusion on the profound peace that I had just encountered. It was like being violently yanked from a beautiful, tranquil dream into the harsh reality of the physical world, and the transition felt disorienting and completely overwhelming. The smells of antiseptic and the low hum of machines were a stark and unpleasant contrast to the pure and infinite love that had permeated the spiritual realm, and I felt like I was being thrust back into a prison of flesh and bone, and it was a sensation I could not deny. My body felt heavy and stiff, as if I were carrying an unbearable weight, and there was a dull, throbbing ache in every muscle and joint, and the feeling of being once again confined to the limitations of a physical form was almost suffocating. The faces of my family, Sarah and Clara, were blurred, but their shapes were familiar, and they were a welcome sight after my journey into the spiritual unknown. And I knew that they had been waiting for me, and that they had been worried, and my heart ached at the realization of what I had put them through. Sarah's face was tear-streaked and drawn with worry, and Clara looked at me with wide, scared eyes, and a pang of guilt shot through me at the sight of their fear. Tears streamed down my own face as I tried to explain what I had seen, to describe the profound experience I had just gone through. But the words seemed jumbled and inadequate, a poor substitute for the actual reality of what had happened, and I realized that I couldn't accurately articulate the depth of what I had seen. They looked at me with a mixture of confusion, concern, and disbelief, and I could tell immediately that they didn't understand what I was trying to say, and I could also see in their eyes that they really didn't want to understand, as it was something that was too far outside the confines of their normal life. The sterile white of the hospital room felt oppressive and suffocating, and the world around me seemed dull and lifeless compared to the vibrant and intense reality that I had just witnessed, and the memory of what I had seen was crystal clear, a beacon of hope in the bleakness of my surroundings, and it was that memory that was going to see me through what was to come. I tried to sit up, to tell them everything, to share the vision I had been shown, to warn them of the darkness that was creeping into their lives. But my body felt weak and unresponsive, and the medical staff rushed to my side, their faces filled with concern, and they were trying to calm me down, and I realized that I was trapped back in the physical world. And the enormous task of sharing this experience was going to be much more difficult than I could have ever imagined, and I knew that there was no time to waste. The world felt different now, somehow muted, like I was seeing it through a veil, and the constant hum of technology that had once been just background noise was now a constant, discordant reminder of the insidious darkness that was lurking just beneath the surface. And I now knew that the shadows were not something to be ignored or trivialized. The faces of people glued to their screens, their vacant and unfocused gazes, filled me with a sense of profound dread, a constant reminder of the unseen forces that were at play. And it wasn't just the technology itself, but the way it was being used to subtly manipulate and control people, to rob them of their humanity. And I had seen the effects in vivid detail. Every time I saw someone mindlessly scrolling through their phone, their eyes glazed over, their minds lost in the digital realm, I felt a chill run down my spine, a reminder of the insidious forces that were slowly and steadily consuming their lives. And I knew that it wasn't just harmless entertainment or mindless distraction, but rather something that was slowly consuming their souls and creating a deep and profound barrier between them and the real world. And that barrier was dangerous and getting stronger. I could see the subtle ways in which these technologies were changing people, making them more isolated and disconnected, and turning them away from the beauty and wonder of the world around them. And I felt an overwhelming sense of urgency to do something about it, to warn them, to wake them up before it was too late, before they had gone too far into the abyss. I now understood the insidious darkness that was lurking beneath the surface of progress and convenience, and I could see the ways in which it was subtly manipulating our lives, tearing at our relationships, and slowly eroding our sense of humanity. And the weight of that knowledge was immense, almost unbearable at times. I was constantly wrestling with the knowledge that I was carrying, and wondering why I was the one who had been given this task. Sharing my experience was often met with skepticism, sometimes with open ridicule, and most people couldn't even begin to understand what I was trying to convey. People were so comfortable in their routines, so accustomed to their digital lives, that they didn't want to be woken up, and they had simply chosen to close their eyes to the truth, even when it was staring them in the face. They preferred to remain in their comfortable bubbles, their lives confined to the digital world, ignoring the warnings and dismissing the truths, and the frustration of seeing people so willfully blind to the danger, to their own demise, was almost unbearable. I felt like I was carrying a heavy burden that nobody else understood, a weight that I had to bear alone, and the knowledge of what was coming was like a constant ache in my heart, and it was a burden that I knew I would have to carry with me until the day I died. I was constantly wrestling with self-doubt and paralyzing fear, questioning if I was strong enough to continue, if I was making any difference at all, and often, I felt like I wanted to just give up and just walk away from it all. But then, I would recall the image of Jesus, the memory of his love, the feeling of that powerful prayer, and it was these images that gave me the strength to keep going, and they were the only things that kept me from giving up entirely. I don't know why I was chosen, of all the people in the world, to experience this, but I do know with absolute certainty that we are all far more powerful than we believe, that we are not powerless in the face of this darkness, and that we have the capacity to resist the insidious forces that seek to control us, to enslave us. Our prayers, our genuine connection to one another, our ability to love and to empathize are our only hope against the darkness, against those insidious forces that seek to disconnect us from our humanity, that seek to keep us isolated and in despair, and our faith, however that manifests, is what will ultimately save us. We must open our eyes and see what's happening before it's too late, before we have crossed the point of no return, and we must choose to break free from the digital chains that are binding us, the virtual prisons that we have built for ourselves, and we must reclaim our lives before we lose ourselves completely. It is a call to action, a desperate plea to awaken from this slumber, this collective hypnosis, and to recognize that the true power does not lie in technology, but in our faith, in our love, in the human connections that make us who we are, and that it is up to us, and us alone, to determine the course of our destiny. The battle is not out there in some distant realm or some future time. It is here, and it is now, in our hearts and in our homes, in our choices and actions. And it requires all of us to stand up and fight for the very souls of humanity, to fight for the future of humanity. Are we too far gone? Can we really change? Can we truly break free from the allure of technology, the constant seduction of the digital world? Or have we been swallowed so deeply that we can no longer see a path back to reality? It's a question that haunts me every day as I continue to witness the insidious creep of the darkness, the subtle ways that it continues to infiltrate our lives, and I am constantly filled with a sense of dread and urgency. And I keep thinking, what was it about that prayer that was so powerful? Why was I the one chosen to bear witness to such a profound event, such a life-altering experience, and what will happen if I fail to convey the truth? And that the answer to this question is beyond me, but I know that I must try. I have no answers. I have only the burden of the vision I was shown, and I must do what I can to share the truth with anyone who will listen, and I must try to convince them that we are capable of so much more. And if this story has touched you, if you have felt even the slightest pull in your heart, please, I beg you, share it and help others to stay vigilant, to stay faithful, and to keep fighting for the light.